Today we uncover the tragic and complex story of Father Michael, the most gracious, divine servant, whose hidden life and secrets led to his brutal murder. Father Michael Stanton was 40-year-old. He was a famous and merciful priest in the city of Brookville, and he was loved and appreciated by everyone. Father Michael Stanton was more than just the local priest. He was a friend, a confidant, and a figure of solace for the people of Brooksville. But even the most devout souls have their secret. The most of all from the locals, a married couple, David and his wife Sarah, visited. This couple was envied by everyone, because the locals considered David a real man who loved his family and wife, because he worked 24/7 to support his family. David Matthews, he was 30 years old. He was called the handsome man of the city, and all the women from the first glance admired him. He was calm, with longing in his eyes. He worked as a teacher at a local high school. Sarah Matthews was 30-year-old, David's wife, organized, dutiful, and active in the church community. Well-liked, but with a fierce, protective side. They first saw each other in this church, and then got engaged here too. Year 2024 is the month of April, which means that lilacs are blooming in the city of Brookville, and who would have thought that such a colorful city harbors such a terrible secret? In the quiet town of Brooksville, where life seemed simple and faith bound its residents together, no one could have imagined the dark secrets that would tear this community apart. This is the story of a forbidden love, a betrayal, and a murder that shocked everyone. It was the month of spring, which means the month of Easter, and the whole city celebrated this holiday, and they spent it in a church. Everyone helped each other, set the table, and painted the eggs, decorating them with different colors. Even Detective Lisa Torres, 40, who also attended church at the time, was invited to this holiday. Easter was very wonderful. Every evening, the whole city gathered in a church and held a choir together, put candles, and gave each other beautiful colored eggs. This Easter has brought many people closer together, even those who are essentially not allowed to be together. David and her wife Sarah attended church almost all the days of the holiday and helped Father Michael. During these days, Father Michael and David became very close, and this led to the fact that he began to attend church more often, even after the holidays. I was planning to renovate the church, then I went to fix chairs, and every day there is a new reason to go to church. David found in Father Michael what he had been missing, not just spiritual guidance, but a connection, a bond that went far beyond the usual bounds of their relationship, a bond that would eventually lead them down a dangerous path. Sarah Matthews was not the type to let things slide. When she suspected her husband was cheating, she took matters into her own hands. What she discovered would push her to the Sarah follows David one evening, sees him entering the cabin with Father Michael. She watches from a distance, and her face contorts with rage as she realizes what's going on. Sarah Matthews had reached her breaking point, and she was ready to do whatever it took to make the pain stop. Sarah bursts into tears, screams at David, threatens to expose him. David admits the affair but begs her to understand. Sarah felt like she was drowning, like everything she'd built her life around was a lie, and he didn't even seem sorry. That was the worst part. Then Sarah buying a gun, rehearsing what she's going to say, shots of her staring at herself in the mirror, preparing for what she believes will be the final confrontation. A dark, stormy night, Sarah's car pulling up outside the cabin. She quietly exits the car, clutching a small handgun. October 23rd. It was a night like any other, until it wasn't. Sarah Matthews had reached her breaking point, and she was ready to do whatever it took to make the pain stop. Sarah barges into the cabin, finding David and Father Michael together. A heated argument breaks out, emotions boiling over. David tries to shield Father Michael, but Sarah is beyond reason. Detective Torres said, "It was chaos." By the time the authorities arrived, the scene was a mess. 2 men lying in pools of blood, and a woman sitting in shock, the weapon still clutched in her hands. A neighbor who called 911 heard screams, and then the shot. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew it was bad. The news spread like wildfire. Father Michael's secret was out, and the town was in shock. How could a man of God have been living a double life? And what drove Sarah to commit such a heinous act? Detective Torres piecing together the evidence, questioning Sarah, trying to understand what drove her to murder. Shots of the courtroom, tense moments as testimonies are given. Detective Torres said, "It wasn't just about infidelity. It was about betrayal, deceit, and a woman who felt like she'd lost everything. But it's never just one person's fault. She snapped, plain and simple. But there was a lot more going on beneath the surface. The church, now mostly empty, its once bustling pews filled with silence. On the night of June 5th, 2024, David Johnson, a 30-year-old architect, and Father Michael Harper, a 40-year-old Catholic priest, were found dead in the rectory of St. Mark's Church. Both had sustained fatal stab wounds. The bodies were discovered by a parishioner who arrived for a late-night prayer and called 911. The prosecution alleges that Sarah Johnson, 41, killed her husband and his secret lover, Father Michael, after discovering their romantic relationship. The defense argues that Sarah had no involvement in the murders and that the evidence is purely circumstantial. Prosecution's case? The prosecution claims Sarah Johnson had a clear motive to commit the murders after learning about the secret relationship between her husband and Father Michael. The key points of evidence presented by the prosecution include: the prosecution presents evidence suggesting that Sarah had discovered David's secret relationship with Father Michael just days before the murders. Emails between David and Father Michael, expressing romantic sentiments, were found on David's computer, and Sarah's internet search history shows queries about how to confront a spouse about infidelity. Sarah had access to the church, as the prosecution contends that she had obtained a spare key to from David, who occasionally assisted with church renovations. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife from Sarah's own home, was found at the crime scene. Blood matching Sarah's DNA was found on Father Michael's clothing, which the prosecution argues indicates a struggle took place between her and the victims. Cell phone tower data placed Sarah's phone near St. Mark's Church at the approximate time of the murders. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station also shows a vehicle resembling Sarah's car in the vicinity around the same time. Witnesses testified that Sarah had recently confronted David about the possibility of an affair, though she did not know it involved a man, let alone a priest. Witnesses also described her as appearing distraught and angry in the days leading up to the murders. The case against Sarah Johnson began like a puzzle, fragments of a story that Detective Torres had to piece together. Two men lay dead: David Johnson, Sarah's husband, and Father Michael, a man of the cloth and David's secret lover. But the motive, the why behind the crime, remained elusive. As Detective Torres walked through the quiet halls of St. Mark's Church, the signs of violence spoke volumes. Blood stained the wooden floors of the rectory, where the two men had drawn their last breaths. The knife that ended their lives had been left behind, a kitchen blade from Sarah's own home. But what drove a woman to such an act of desperation? Torres pored over the evidence late into the night. The messages between David and Father Michael, the expressions of love and longing. Sarah had uncovered these just days before the murders. But would the discovery of infidelity be enough to push her over the edge? Torres said, "Sarah, you must have known about the affair. There are messages. Your husband was asking Father Michael to leave the priesthood for him. You're telling me that didn't make you angry?" Sarah's eyes were hard to read: grief, defiance, perhaps even a trace of anger. But her voice was steady, her answers unwavering. Sarah said, "Of course I was upset, but I never wanted them dead." Detective Torres was not convinced. The evidence was mounting. Her car was seen near the church the night of the murders. Her DNA was found on Father Michael's clothes. But still, there was no confession. She was either innocent or a master of masking the truth. The courtroom became a battleground, with the prosecution painting a picture of a scorned woman lashing out in a moment of rage. District Attorney Williams said, "Sarah discovered the betrayal, and with it came the overwhelming sense of humiliation. This wasn't just an affair, it was a love affair between her husband and a priest. It shattered her world." But Sarah's defense attorney fired back, pointing to the lack of direct evidence and the possibility of another suspect, someone who knew about the affair and acted out of hatred. Defense attorney Robert James. Father Michael had received threats, hateful messages, and none of these leads were pursued with any seriousness. The prosecution wants you to believe this is an open and shut case. It's not. Torres could feel the weight of the case pressing on him. He returned to the church one more time, retracing the victim's final steps. He imagined the confrontation, the words exchanged. If Sarah was there, if she confronted them, what had they said to provoke such violence? Her denials left him with questions he could not yet answer. Was Sarah a murderer trying to talk her way out, or a grieving wife being crushed by circumstance? The jury's decision loomed, the final step in a journey that began with betrayal and ended in bloodshed. Detective Torres had pieced together what he could, but would it be enough to convince the jury of Sarah's guilt? Or had the truth slipped through his fingers, just like the blood on the church's floor? And so, the fate of Sarah Johnson rested in the hands of 12 strangers, who would soon decide if she was a victim of circumstance, or a woman driven by rage to commit the ultimate sin. For weeks, this case had dominated the courtroom. It was more than just a murder trial. It was a story of shattered lives and raw emotions, where the line between right and wrong blurred, and where every testimony seemed to contradict the one before it. Sarah Johnson, a woman once seen as a loving wife and a devout member of her community, now stood accused of a crime so heinous that it defied comprehension: the brutal murder of her husband, David Johnson, and his secret lover, Father Michael Harper. The betrayal had been unexpected, the affair scandalous, and the deaths grotesque. Sarah's was barely a whisper. "I told you, someone could have taken my car. The DNA. It could have gotten there from when I saw him at the church a week earlier. You have to understand. I loved David. Why would I kill him? And what did you do in her place?" Her protests sounded sincere, but the cracks in her story were becoming harder to ignore. Torres had dealt with cases like this before. People so convinced of their own lies that they started to believe them. Or maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth, and the pieces weren't falling into place because they were being forced to fit where they didn't belong. District Attorney Williams, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have presented evidence that clearly establishes Sarah Johnson's motive, opportunity, and means to commit these murders. She discovered her husband's betrayal, found out that not only had he been unfaithful, but that his secret lover was a priest, a man sworn to God. Her world unraveled. The humiliation and rage she felt drove her to confront them that night at St. Mark's. She brought a knife from her own home, and in the heat of the moment, she acted. On August 3rd, 2024, the trial was scheduled. Based on the evidence presented and the evaluations from mental health professionals, it is the court's decision that Sarah Johnson is not criminally responsible for the deaths of David Johnson and Father Michael Harper. Expert testimony has established that she was suffering from a severe mental disorder at the time of the incident, impairing her ability to understand the nature and consequences of her actions. The court finds her not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict hung in the air, its impact rippling through the room. The decision had come as a shock to many. Sarah was not to be punished in the traditional sense, but her freedom was not guaranteed either. For those who had followed the case, it seemed as though justice was slipping through their fingers, just as the truth had, time and time again. The defense had argued tirelessly that Sarah's actions were not the result of a rational decision, but rather the consequence of a mind unraveling under unbearable stress. In the weeks leading up to the murders, experts testified, Sarah had exhibited signs of severe emotional distress, paranoia, anxiety, even hallucinations. The betrayal she felt upon discovering her husband's affair with Father Michael had shattered her perception of reality, driving her into a psychological state where she was no longer in control. The mental health evaluations painted a picture of a woman on the brink, who had finally toppled over the edge. But while the court's decision spared her from a prison sentence, it did not mean she would walk free. Do you consider mental illness to be an excuse for killing a person? The judge ordered that Sarah be committed to a secure psychiatric facility for an indefinite period. She was to undergo intensive treatment and would not be released until it was determined by a panel of mental health experts that she no longer posed a threat to herself or others. In essence, her fate was now in the hands of doctors, rather than the criminal justice system. It was a stark and sterile place, with long white corridors and the faint, lingering smell of antiseptic. As Sarah settled into her new environment, the days blended into each other. She attended therapy sessions where she was asked to relive the events that had led her here, to confront the deep-seated emotions that had driven her actions. But she struggled to recall the night of the murders in detail. There were gaps, like missing frames in a reel of film. It was as though her mind had compartmentalized the trauma, locking it away where she could not reach it. Sarah's treatment was a long and grueling process, one that forced her to confront not only the tragedy of that night, but also the pain and despair that had built up long before. It was not just the betrayal that had broken her. It was years of suppressed anger, feelings of inadequacy, and a profound sense of loneliness that had festered beneath the surface. The affair had merely been the final spark that ignited a powder keg of repressed emotions. As the months went on, Sarah's recollections began to come into focus. She spoke of an overwhelming sense of betrayal that night, an anger so consuming that it felt like it belonged to someone else. She described moments where she felt detached, as though watching a movie unfold before her eyes. It was a classic sign of dissociation, the psychiatrist explained, a mind's way of protecting itself from an unbearable reality. In the group sessions, Sarah found herself surrounded by people with stories different from hers, but suffering that was all too familiar. For the first time, she began to open up, to share not only what happened that night, but the years of silent struggle that had preceded it. She spoke of her marriage, the pressures of appearing perfect on the outside while feeling empty inside. It was a cathartic release, and as she began to piece together the broken fragments of her mind, she started to understand not only the tragedy, but herself. As time passed, the Sarah who had first entered the facility seemed to fade, replaced by a woman who was beginning to heal, to find some semblance of peace. But the process was not without setbacks. There were dark days where the weight of guilt would crush her spirit, where the realization of what she had done would threaten to pull her back into the depths. It was during these moments that her doctors monitored her closely, ensuring she did not slip back into a state of despair from which there might be no return. She spent many hours like this, staring at the world outside. She wondered if she would ever be part of it again. The doctor spoke of progress and recovery, but she knew that even if she were one day released, she would not return to the life she once knew. Her old life was gone, buried alongside the husband and priest, whose deaths still haunted her. The court had decided she was not guilty by reason of insanity, sparing her from a life behind bars. But in many ways she remained imprisoned, by her mind, by her memories, by the unforgiving nature of the past. It was a sentence of a different kind, one with no clear end. Whether she would ever truly be free was a question that only time could answer. For now, Sarah Johnson's journey was one of slow recovery, one step at a time, toward a future that still felt uncertain. And so, she remained in the facility, not as a criminal, but as a patient, a woman who had lost herself in the darkness and was slowly finding her way back to the light. Sarah's journey in the psychiatric hospital had been one of gradual healing, but the scars of her past remained etched deeply in her mind. She had been making progress, learning to navigate her emotions, confronting her trauma in therapy sessions, and finding solace in art. Yet on this day, an unexpected turn of fate would change everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had just finished a painting that depicted a serene landscape, a stark contrast to the chaos within her. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. But that evening, as the nurses conducted their routine checks, an unsettling silence filled the air. It was the kind of silence that hung heavy with unspoken fears and foreboding. Sarah was found in her room, unresponsive. Sarah Johnson was pronounced dead September 30th, 2024 at 7:43 p.m. on that fateful day. The cause of death was quickly determined to be a cardiac arrest, brought on by complications from the medications she had been prescribed. Her doctors had been closely monitoring her, but in the end, it was a cruel twist of fate that took her from this world. Her fellow patients were informed of the news in hushed tones, and a heavy grief settled over the psychiatric ward. For many, Sarah had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for those struggling with their own demons. They had watched her fight to reclaim her life, and now, just as she seemed to be finding her footing, she was gone. The staff gathered in the nurses' station, their faces drawn with sorrow. The loss of a patient is never easy, especially one who had fought so valiantly to heal. In the days that followed, the hospital held a memorial service in Sarah's honor. The room was filled with the soft glow of candles, their flames flickering in the dim light. Fellow patients shared their memories of her, the way she had inspired them to open up, how her laughter had filled the sterile hallways with warmth. One patient spoke about the painting Sarah had created just days before her death. It was like she was reaching for something, they said, something beautiful, something beyond this place. And in that moment, it became clear that Sarah's impact would linger, even in her absence. She had brought light into the darkness of their lives, showing them that healing was possible, even amidst the pain. As the service concluded, there was a sense of bittersweet reflection. While Sarah's life had ended far too soon, her struggle had not been in vain. Her journey through the darkness had inspired those around her to confront their own battles, to seek help, and to strive for a brighter tomorrow. But as they mourned, a question hung in the air. Had they truly understood the depths of Sarah's pain? Had they seen the battles she fought when the doors closed, when the lights went out? And more importantly, what did it mean to lose someone who had been fighting for her life? In the weeks that followed, her presence was felt in the hospital. The staff hung her paintings in the common areas as a reminder of the light she brought into the world. Each brushstroke told a story of resilience, of hope, of a woman who had battled her inner demons but had been ultimately overtaken by the very system that sought to help her. Sarah's death was a somber reminder of the fragility of life, the unpredictability of recovery, and the harsh realities of mental health treatment. While she had found peace in her final moments, her story would continue to echo through the halls of the facility, a poignant testament to the struggles of so many who fight in silence. In the end, Sarah Johnson had become more than just a patient. She had become a part of a larger conversation about mental health, about understanding, and about compassion. Her life, though cut short, had sparked a light in others, urging them to seek their own paths to healing, even if that meant confronting the darkest corners of their souls. After her death, nurses found a letter under her bed where it was written about a request that her paintings be sold and a sum of money be given to an orphanage where she grew up. This made everyone cry, because no one could believe that such a kind and caring woman could do terrible things to other people's lives. A memorial for Father Michael. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the town of Brooksville was left to pick up the pieces, but the wounds ran deep, and some scars would never heal. Detective Torres said, "Love can make people do crazy things, but this wasn't love, it was obsession, and it led to a tragedy that could have been avoided." Some stories don't have happy endings. In Brooksville, a forbidden love turned into a fatal obsession, leaving behind broken hearts and shattered lives. It's a chilling reminder that even in the quietest of places, darkness can lurk just below the surface. Final shots of the town, the church, and the lonely cabin fade to black. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Stay tuned for more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes.